those whose politics is to destroy, to demolish, dismantle, they're not going to change their instincts. This is, in many respects, this is their moment, right? We can't match them by being timid imitations of them. But as the U.S. changes dramatically its policies, and that's the right of the United States, as it changes those policies, many of our former strengths have become our vulnerabilities.
On May 9th, 2026, just 3 days ago, something happened in Toronto that Washington should be paying very close attention to. Canada's Prime Minister delivered a speech that, beneath its measured language and policy announcements, carried a message so fundamental it could reshape North American relations for a generation. Canada is no longer designing its future around the assumption that the United States will be a reliable partner. You are watching Global Sketch if you want the most data-backed, source-verified analysis of what is actually happening between Canada and America right now. Subscribe immediately, because what we are breaking down today goes far beyond a single speech. The numbers behind Canada's pivot are already showing up in trade data, tourism statistics, and defense commitments, and they tell a story that headlines alone cannot capture. At the Global Progress Action Summit in Toronto on May 9th, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before delegates from across Europe and Canada and delivered what the Globe and Mail described as a landmark statement on Canada's new economic direction. The key line reported by both Bloomberg and CBC was this: Canada's close economic ties to the United States, once a defining strength, have become vulnerabilities that must be corrected. Let that phrase sit for a moment. A Canadian Prime Minister, in a formal address, describing the relationship with America not as an asset, but as a liability that requires active correction. That is a sentence no Canadian leader has spoken in public in living memory. The speech came 1 week after Carney met President Trump in the Oval Office, their first in-person meeting described by diplomatic sources as occurring at the lowest point in bilateral relations in decades. It was not a warm reset. It was a formal acknowledgement of a ruptured trust, followed 3 days later by a public address making clear that Canada's planning horizon no longer centers on Washington. Carney was direct about the cause. According to CBC's reporting on April 19th, he stated publicly that the United States has fundamentally changed its approach to trade, raising tariffs to levels last seen during the Great Depression. That historical comparison is not rhetoric. Under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the United States has imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, 10% on aluminum, and 25% on automobile sectors that until 2025 were so deeply integrated between the two economies that the distinction between American and Canadian manufacturing in autos, for example, was almost meaningless. Speech itself was important, but the data behind it tells an even more compelling story, because the pivot Carney is describing is not just strategic positioning, it is already showing up in verified trade statistics. Canada data, reported by the Hub on May 5, 2026, shows that the United States currently receives 75% of Canadian exports. That figure has been broadly stable for decades, and it illustrates how structurally dependent Canada's export economy remains on the American market. But the directional shift is real, and accelerating. Canada's non-U.S. exports rose sharply in 2025 and March 2026 alone, the most recent month of complete data. Exports to countries other than the United States surged to 148% compared to the same month in 2025, even as exports to the U.S. fell 66%. Carney himself stated in the May 9th speech that Canada is on track to double its non-U.S. exports this decade at trade deal pipeline backs that ambition, according to reporting from Modern Diplomacy and Reuters. Canada has concluded agreements with Ecuador and Indonesia, signed a major investment deal with the UAE, restarted trade talks with India after a diplomatic freeze under the previous government, and most controversially signed a preliminary trade agreement with China that allowed 49 zero Chinese electric vehicles into Canada at a reduced tariff of 61%, down from 100% in exchange. China removed tariffs on Canadian canola and several agricultural products. Trade Minister Maninder Sidhu confirmed that Canada is now simultaneously targeting the Philippines, Thailand, Mercosur, Saudi Arabia, and India for further agreements. Foreign direct investment into Canada has reached its highest level into decades, running at more than double the per capita rate of every other G7 economy, according to figures Carney cited in the May 9th address to the world. It appears is responding to Canada's open for business signal. The question is whether that signal can translate into durable export volume that actually offsets U.S. market dependence by and trade. Carney laid out a defense commitment in the May 9th speech that, if delivered, would represent the most significant expansion of Canadian military spending since the Cold War. He described Canada as now catalyzing $500 billion, $500 billion in investment in defense, security, and resilience. Over the next decade, Canada's current defense spending sits at approximately 14% of GDP. The NATO target is 2%. The Carney government has committed to reaching 2% this fiscal year, but the May 9 speech gestured towards something considerably more ambitious, a defense posture anchored not just in meeting NATO obligations, but in what Carney described as building strategic autonomy. That phrase, strategic autonomy, is borrowed from the European Union's own post-Ukraine strategic doctrine. Canada is explicitly aligning its defense philosophy with the European framework, not the American one. As part of this alignment, Canada became the first non-European country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe initiative, known as SAFE, which opens Canadian defense manufacturers to European procurement contracts. Canada is also one of the largest per capita contributors to Ukraine's support among G7 nations. The combination of the SAFE membership, the Ukraine commitment, and the $500 billion defense investment signal is a coherent strategic message. Canada is deepening its security relationships with Europe at precisely the moment it is loosening the assumptions around American dependability. Is where the story moves from policy to behavior, because while Carney was delivering speeches about strategic autonomy, ordinary Canadians were already executing their own version of it, spontaneously and at scale. Data on Canadian cross-border travel to the United States is extraordinary. According to RBC Economics, Canadian resident return trips from the United States fell to 154% in 2025 compared to 2024 by January 2026. That year-over-year decline was still running at 243%. According to Statistics Canada, vehicle crossings, which typically account for almost half of all Canada-U.S. travel, fell 32% year-over-year in early 2026, according to Travel and Tour World. Air travel between the two countries was also down double digits in January 2026. Cross-border trips decreased 21% year-over-year. According to the Canadian Tourism Commission, money that was not being spent in American border states, Florida resorts, and New York shopping districts was being redirected inside Canada. Domestic tourism spending increased 27% in 2025. Accommodation and dining spending within Canada rose 56% for the year. Tourism GDP grew at an annualized rate of 48% in the fourth quarter of 2025, significantly outpacing the overall Canadian economy, which contracted 6% annualized in the same period. More than 40% of Canadians who stopped traveling to the United States indicated they plan to continue prioritizing domestic destinations, according to survey data cited by Travel and Tour World. Carney acknowledged this consumer shift directly in his May 9th speech, crediting Canadians for their spontaneous response and describing the government's role as following the public's example, introducing by Canadian procurement policies cheap rail travel for youth and families, and free access to national parks and museums through the Canada Strong Pass program. When governments describe themselves as following citizens rather than leading them, it usually signals a political consensus that has already formed in Canada. The economic and cultural separation from the United States appears to have already formed in the population. Before policy caught upon, section of Carney's May 9th speech received less attention in headlines, but may be the most structurally significant. His articulation of what sovereign capability means in 2026. He listed it explicitly: critical minerals, space-based communications, sovereign cloud infrastructure, artificial intelligence, payment systems, clean energy, and vaccines. These are the inputs required for genuine strategic independence. In the modern era, and Canada, he argued, is positioning itself to be a provider of these capabilities to allied nations. The critical minerals dimension is particularly important. Canada holds confirmed reserves of all 12 minerals. On NATO's critical minerals priority list, it has signed $18 billion worth of critical minerals agreements across 20 mineral categories with allied nations. It is the world's third largest oil producer, fourth largest natural gas producer, and the largest hydro-renewable base among G7 nations in a world where China controls the refining and processing of most critical minerals, and where the United States is imposing tariffs on its own allies. Canada is marketing itself as the democratic, rule of law alternative for countries seeking supply chain security. Carney described Canada's approach as building a dense web of partnerships, what he called variable geometry across strategic capabilities. The phrase comes from European integration theory, where it refers to a multi-speed system where different nations cooperate at different levels, depending on shared interests. Borrowing that framework signals Canada's intent to build a complex, multi-layered alliance structure rather than a single dominant bilateral relationship that is a fundamental departure from the Canada that organized its entire strategic posture around the assumption of American partnership in the trade data and defense commitments. The May 9th speech carried a philosophical argument that was impossible to miss, even though Carney was careful never to name his target directly. Describe a politics that thrives on scarcity, feeds on division, and promises strength through demolition. He said that nostalgia is not a strategy. He invoked the Marshall McLuhan observation that our age of anxiety is caused by trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools and yesterday's concepts, and he argued that the international rules-based order that Canada helped build no longer works as it once did and cannot simply be restored through wishful thinking. Every one of these phrases is a recognizable description of the political style that has defined the Trump administration: the grievance framing, the demolition of multilateral institutions, the promise that returning to an imagined past constitutes a strategy. Carney positioned himself and Canada as the alternative, not just economically, but philosophically, a country that builds rather than demolishes, that forges partnerships rather than withdrawing from them, that treats openness as a source of strength rather than vulnerability. The audience in Toronto understood exactly what was being said, and the language was chosen with the precision of someone who knows that what he says will be read in Washington as carefully as it is received in Toronto. For any American viewer watching this, the most important question is, what does the United States actually stand to lose from this Canadian pivot? The answer is larger than most Americans appreciate. Canada is the single largest export destination for the United States, larger than China, larger than Mexico in some years, larger than the entire European Union. Bilateral trade between Canada and the United States runs at approximately $36 billion per day. The two economies are integrated not just at the port level, but at the factory floor level, particularly in automotive, aerospace, steel, and energy, where components routinely cross the border multiple times during production. Canadian crude oil supplies approximately 60% of U.S. Midwest refinery capacity. Canadian hydroelectric power supplies significant portions of the northeastern United States grid. Consumer data already shows American border communities feeling the impact. Canadian vehicle crossings into the United States fell 30% in early 2026. The economic damage to border state economies: Michigan, New York, Washington State, North Dakota, that depend on Canadian visitor spending in casinos, retail, and hospitality, is documented, and ongoing. The U.S. Travel Association has acknowledged that Canadian visitor decline is a significant economic problem for the American tourism industry. Known of this is irreversible. Canada has not closed its door. Carney was explicit in the May 9th speech that Canada remains open to deeper integration with the United States, including what he called Fortress North America in selected sectors. The offer is on the table. But the framing has shifted from dependency to optionality. Canada will work with the United States if the United States chooses to be a reliable partner. If not, Canada has alternatives. That is a negotiating position that did not exist 3 years ago. Canada's exports to the U.S. fell 66% in March, while non-U.S. exports rose to 148%. Cross-border visits from Canada to the U.S. fell 254% in 2025 and are still contracting at 21 to 24%. Year over year in early 2026, Canada has signed new agreements with Indonesia, China, the UAE, and Ecuador, and is pursuing deals simultaneously with India, the Philippines, Mercosur, and Saudi Arabia. Canada committed to $500 billion in defense investment over the next decade, and it became the first non-European nation to join the EU's SAFE defense procurement initiatives. It is not a diplomatic dispute that will resolve with a single phone call. The structural shift that Carney's government is executing and that Canadian consumers are reinforcing through their own behavior reflects a fundamental reassessment of what reliable partnership looks like in the 21st century. That reassessment will outlast any individual administration on either side of the border. Subscribe to Global Sketch right now for this kind of weekly, source-verified geopolitical analysis. Drop a comment below. Do you think Canada's pivot will permanently reshape North American relations? Or will economic gravity eventually pull the two countries back together? We want to see that debate. See you in the next one.